Once upon a time, these world leaders were the most powerful people in the world. They held the fate of their nations in their hands, dictating how the country is run, who gets to be the next president, and whether they go to war with other countries or not. But then it all fell apart, and these powerful heads of state ended up behind bars. Welcome to my channel, and today, let's find out how these world leaders went from power to prison. Our first story is about Jean Kambanda, the former Prime Minister of Rwanda. Jean Kambanda was one of the most important members of the Hutu government during the Rwandan genocide. When the plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down, there was a power vacuum. This was filled by Kambanda. He was the Prime Minister at the time. It was under his leadership that the entire Tutsi population of Rwanda was exterminated. Nearly 800,000 people being slaughtered in just 100 days. So what did he do after this? Kambanda fled to Zaire. However, the UN eventually handed him over to the Rwandan authorities, and in 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the genocide. The interesting thing here is that Kambanda became the first head of state to be convicted of genocide. Next, we have Jakaya Membe. Jakaya Membe served as the Vice President of Tanzania between 2006 and 2015. In 2017, he was found guilty of embezzlement and abuse of office. The court found that he had misused public funds and assets for personal gain, as well as using his position to unfairly benefit himself and others. Membe also served as the Minister of Infrastructure Development from 2006 to 2013, during which he oversaw several major infrastructure projects in the country. But it was alleged that he used his position to secure lucrative contracts for himself and his associates at the expense of the government. He was also accused of mismanaging funds allocated to these projects. The exact amount that Membe embezzled is not publicly known, but it is estimated to be in the millions of dollars. After being found guilty, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and this was later reduced to 7 years. Moving on, we have Chotkuyulu Tasu. He was the president of the Central Asian nation of Kazakhstan from 1991 to 2019. Under his leadership, Kazakhstan experienced significant economic growth and became one of the wealthiest countries in Central Asia. However, he also faced criticism for his authoritarian rule and for suppressing dissent. In January 2022, mass protests erupted in Kazakhstan over a hike in fuel prices. The protests quickly turned into an anti-government movement, with many people calling for political reform and the resignation of Tasu. The government responded with a violent crackdown, and hundreds of people were killed. The situation escalated when armed groups seized to airports and several government buildings. Tasu fled to Russia and later returned to Kazakhstan after the situation stabilized. However, he resigned shortly after amid pressure from the opposition and the threat of further protests, and so he was removed from power. Soon after, Tashev was arrested on charges of bribery and abuse of power. He was stripped of his immunity from prosecution and sent to prison, where he remains till today. Moving on, we have Hosni Mubarak, the former president of Egypt. Mubarak came to power in 1981 when he succeeded Anwar Sadat after Sadat was assassinated. During his 3-decade rule, Mubarak maintained a tight grip on power and suppressed any form of dissent. He faced numerous allegations of corruption and human rights abuses. In January 2011, as part of the wider Arab Spring movement, mass protests erupted in Egypt demanding Mubarak's resignation. The protests continued for several weeks, with millions of Egyptians taking to the streets. Amid the growing unrest, Mubarak resigned from office on February 2011, ending his 30-year rule. Soon after this, he was arrested and charged with several crimes, including the killing of protesters. Throughout his trial, Mubarak maintained his innocence. However, in May 2012, he was found guilty of ordering the killing of protesters and was sentenced to life in prison. In 2014, an appeals court overturned the ruling and acquitted Mubarak. But in 2015, Egypt's highest appeals court upheld a 2012 ruling that had sentenced him to 3 years in prison for embezzling public funds. He was released in March 2020 due to health concerns. He died in September that year. Moving on, we have Alberto Fujimori. He served as the president of Peru from 1990 to 2000. Fujimori came to power promising to restore economic stability and security. And indeed, during his first term, he implemented a series of neoliberal economic policies that led to significant growth and poverty reduction. However, his authoritarian tendencies and corruption scandals tarnished his legacy. In November 2000, amidst a corruption scandal and a series of protests, Fujimori dissolved Peru's Congress and assumed emergency powers. This move was widely seen as a coup d'état and led to international condemnation. In 2001, the Peruvian Supreme Court ruled that Fujimori's assumption of emergency powers was unconstitutional. Facing impeachment and possible arrest, Fujimori fled to Japan in 2005. In 2017, he was extradited back to Peru, where he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the 1992 killings of two journalists. In 2018, an appeals court upheld the conviction and sentence. In 2020, Fujimori's lawyers filed a motion to reduce his sentence on the grounds of ill health. However, this was rejected by the judge. Next, we have Plamen Orsharsky. He served as the Prime Minister of Bulgaria from 2013 to 2014. Bulgaria has been plagued by corruption and organized crime for many years, and Orsharsky's government was no exception. In 2013, he was involved in a scandal in which his wife was accused of using her influence to secure a lucrative contract for a company she had links to. The scandal led to widespread protests and calls for Orsharsky's resignation. The center-right coalition that had brought Orsharsky to power withdrew their support, leading to the collapse of his government. In 2014, he was appointed as the chairman of the state-owned Bulgarian Defense Holding, a position that gave him control over major defense contractors. This move was seen as a way to reward Orsharsky and his party for their support in the previous government. However, it also raised concerns about the lack of transparency and accountability in the country's defense industry. Orsharsky was later charged with abuse of power and in 2019 was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Moving on, we have Rafael Núñez. Rafael Núñez served as the president of Paraguay from 2008 to 2013. His presidency was marked by several controversies and corruption scandals. In June 2021, the Supreme Court of Paraguay voted to remove Núñez from office and bar him from holding public office for 10 years. The decision was based on the findings of a trial that had been going on since 2019, in which Núñez had been accused of accepting bribes and kickbacks in exchange for granting government contracts to companies linked to Brazilian construction firm Odebrecht. The trial was part of a wider investigation into Odebrecht's operations in Latin America, which had revealed that the company had paid millions of dollars in bribes to secure government contracts in several countries. Núñez had been accused of accepting at least $4 million in bribes during his presidency. Following his removal from office, Núñez was placed under house arrest and later transferred to a prison where he remains till today. And finally, we have Tayyip Erdogan, the former president of Turkey. On May 28, 2023, Erdogan won the presidential election in Turkey, securing a third term in office. His victory came after a runoff vote against his main challenger, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. However, there are allegations that the election was rigged in Erdogan's favor. The opposition claims that millions of votes were cast illegally and that the voting process was marred by irregularities and fraud. There are also reports of a low voter turnout, which has raised questions about the legitimacy of Erdogan's win. The United States, European Union, and other international organizations have called for an independent investigation into the election to ensure its credibility. If the allegations are proven to be true, it would be a major blow to Turkey's democracy and could have far-reaching implications for the country's future. Erdogan has been in power for over 2 decades, and his critics accuse him of becoming increasingly autocratic. A rigged election would only serve to legitimize his grip on power and could lead to further crackdowns on dissent and human rights abuses. A lot of these leaders got too much power too young and then went on a rampage, pillaging everything they could. Well, that's all for today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and I'll catch you in the next one.